The wind did not just blow across the high plains surrounding Faircross, it scoured them. It was a relentless, invisible grit that chewed at the paint on the storefronts and stripped the bark from the cottonwoods lining the dried-up creek bed. It was the year 1876, and the territory felt less like a land of promise and more like a test of endurance designed by a cruel god. To the east, the flat horizon stretched until it blurred into a bruised purple haze. To the west, the mountains rose like jagged teeth, their peaks dusted with snow that never seemed to melt, mocking the parched earth below. Faircross itself was barely a town. It was a collection of gray, weathered timber clinging to the edge of survival, huddled against the vastness of the prairie. A general store, a blacksmith, a church with a leaning steeple, and the saloon, always the saloon, made up the spine of the community. Dust devils danced down the main street, unchallenged by the few horses tethered to hitching posts. 3 miles outside of town, on a failing patch of homestead land that looked more like a graveyard for crops than a farm, Josie Hart fought her daily war against the elements. Josie was 24 years old, though the mirror, if she had the time or vanity to look in one, would have shown a woman who looked 10 years older. Her hair, the color of dried wheat, was pulled back severely to keep it out of her eyes. Her hands were no longer the soft hands of a girl. They were cracked, the knuckles swollen from the cold, the palms calloused from the handle of the axe and the bail of the water bucket. Her dress was a faded calico that had once been blue but was now an undefined gray, patched at the elbows and hem. She walked from the well to the cabin, the weight of 2 full buckets pulling her shoulders down. Her boots crunched on the frost-hardened ground. Every step was a negotiation with gravity and exhaustion. The homestead was silent save for the wind and the pathetic lowing of her single, rib-thin cow, Bess, who stood near the empty trough waiting for the water Josie carried. The town of Faircross knew Josie Hart, or at least they thought they did. When she rode into town for supplies, counting her copper coins with agonizing care, the women would pull their skirts aside as she passed on the boardwalk. They offered her pity, but it was a cold, sharp kind of pity, the kind that tasted like vinegar. The men were worse. They watched her with a mixture of suspicion and hungry speculation. They knew her history, or the parts of it that made for good gossip. They knew she had not arrived in Faircross as a mail-order bride or a school teacher. She had come 3 years ago as a girl working in Luther Grady's saloon. They whispered about what she had done in the rooms above the bar. They whispered about how she had married Tom Hart, one of Luther's brutal foremen, a man with a heavy fist and a thirst for rye whiskey. And they whispered about how Tom had died 6 months ago. A mining accident, the sheriff had written in the ledger. A tunnel collapse at one of the small claims in the foothills. But people in Faircross liked their stories dark. They said Josie was cursed. They said a woman who had been owned by Luther Grady and beaten by Tom Hart might have loosened a timber support beam if she had the chance. They said she was trouble wrapped in a worn-out dress. Josie poured the water into the trough, watching the thin stream splash against the algae-slick wood. She ignored the phantom voices of the town. She had enough ghosts of her own. As she turned back toward the cabin, a sudden, sharp memory assaulted her. It was triggered by nothing more than the scent of sagebrush crushed under her boot. But suddenly she was back in the velvet-choked parlor of the Golden Steer Saloon. She could smell cheap whiskey and stale tobacco. She could feel the iron grip of Luther Grady's hand on her wrist, his fingers digging into her pulse. "You are an investment, Josephine," he had said, his voice smooth as oil. "A man protects his investments." She remembered the paper he had placed on the desk. A contract. She had been young, desperate, and starving when she signed it, believing it was an agreement for housekeeping wages. She had not understood the legal words that chained her to him, that listed her time, her labor, and her presence as commodities he controlled. She remembered the shame that had washed over her when she realized she could not leave, that the debt she supposedly accrued for room and board grew faster than her earnings. She shook her head violently, physically tossing the memory away. That was gone. Tom was dead. The saloon was behind her. She looked at her present reality. It was harsh, but it was hers. The cabin was a single room built of rough-hewn logs, the chinking between them falling out in chunks. The roof leaked whenever the snow melted or the spring rains came. The fields she had tried to plant with corn had withered under the drought, leaving only brown stalks that rattled in the wind. It was a life of bone-deep cold and aching solitude. At night, the coyotes howled from the ridges, sounding like laughing madmen, and the cabin creaked as if it were groaning in pain, but it was quiet. There were no fists. There were no drunken demands. She reached the porch and picked up a hammer and a handful of reclaimed nails. A section of shingles had come loose in the last gale, and if she did not fix it before winter truly set in, she would freeze in her bed. She climbed the rickety ladder, the wind cutting through her threadbare wool coat as if it were made of lace. She was halfway through hammering a warped shingle when she heard the sound of wheels. Josie froze. The hammer raised. It was not the rattle of a supply wagon or the heavy plod of a plow horse. It was the rhythmic, crisp trot of quality animals and the smooth roll of a well-sprung buggy. She turned on the ladder, shading her eyes against the glare of the low sun. A black buggy was coming up the track, pulled by two high-stepping bays. The varnish on the carriage gleamed, an alien object in this landscape of dust and matte gray. Dread, cold and heavy, settled in her stomach. She knew who it was before the buggy even stopped. Luther Grady stepped down from the carriage. He was a man in his 50s, thick through the chest, with a face that had hardened into a permanent expression of arrogance. He wore a fine coat of dark wool with a velvet collar, polished riding boots that had never seen a day of mud, and a gray hat with a pristine brim. He looked at the leaning fence posts and the starving cow with unmasked disgust. Josie climbed down the ladder slowly. She did not wipe the dust from her hands. She did not smooth her hair. She stood between the house and the intruder, gripping the hammer at her side. "Mr. Grady," she said. Her voice was flat, hoarding its emotion. "Mrs. Hart," Luther replied. He did not remove his hat. He walked toward her, stopping just inside the gate. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on the fraying collar of her dress and the rough skin of her face. It was the look a man gave a horse he was considering sending to the knacker's yard. "You look tired, Josie." "I am working," she said. "Something you might not recognize from a carriage seat." Luther chuckled, a dry sound like dry leaves skittering over stone. "Sharp tongue. I always did like that about you, even when it needed correcting." He took a cigar from his pocket and lit it, taking his time, forcing her to wait. The sweet, pungent smoke drifted toward her, sickeningly familiar. "State your business." "Luther, I have shingles to fix before dark. My business is business. Josie, you know that." He gestured vaguely at the desolate land around them. "I came to see how you were managing. It seems the answer is poorly." "I am managing fine." "Are you?" He took a folded paper from his inside pocket. "Because by my count, you are behind on everything. You are behind on the mortgage payments Tom took out. You are behind on the funeral expenses I fronted for you out of the kindness of my heart." "I never asked you to pay for the funeral," Josie said, her grip on the hammer tightening until her knuckles turned white. "You ordered the expensive casket. You ordered the stone. A man like Tom deserved a decent burial. He worked for me. He was loyal." Luther tapped the ash from his cigar onto the frozen ground. "And then there is the matter of the original contract, the one you signed 5 years ago." "I worked that off," Josie said, her voice rising slightly. "I worked in your kitchen and your bar for 3 years. Then I married Tom. That contract is done." Luther shook his head slowly, a mock-sympathetic smile playing on his lips. "That is the trouble with women. Josie, you do not understand the finer points of law. The contract was for a term of service or repayment of the initial investment plus interest. When you married Tom, the debt transferred. Now Tom is dead. The debt falls back to the widow." He took a step closer. Josie held her ground, though every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. "I have nothing for you, Luther. Look around. Take the cow if you want. She is dry anyway." Luther stepped closer still, invading her space. He smelled of bay rum and expensive tobacco, a scent that made her stomach turn. He lowered his voice, dropping the pretense of business. "I do not want the cow, Josie, and I do not want this pile of firewood you call a house." He looked at her, his eyes hard and shiny, devoid of any warmth. "You seem to have forgotten how the world works. You think because Tom died, you are a free woman? You think you can play at being a farmer out here in the dirt?" "I am free," she whispered. Luther laughed. "You were mine once, my property. Don't forget that." The words hit her like a physical blow. Property. It was the word he had used when he bought her contract from the orphanage. It was the word Tom had used when he dragged her home from church. It was a word that stripped her of her soul and left her as nothing more than livestock. "The contract gives me rights, Josie," Luther said softly. "Rights to reclaim my assets if the debt is not serviced. That includes the land, and it includes the labor of the debtor." He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. Josie flinched as if he had burned her. She slapped his hand away. "Get off my land," she said. Her voice shook, not with fear, but with a rage so hot it threatened to incinerate her. "Get out." Luther withdrew his hand, his expression cooling to ice. "I will give you 30 days. Josie, find the money or find the good sense to come back to the Golden Steer where you belong. I might even have a room for you, but do not think you can hide out here forever." He turned and walked back to his buggy. He climbed in, took the reins, and slapped them against the horse's rumps. The buggy rolled away, leaving a cloud of dust that hung in the still, cold air. Josie stood frozen until the buggy was a black speck on the horizon. Then, the hammer slipped from her fingers and hit the ground with a dull thud. Her hands began to tremble. The trembling started in her fingers and spread to her arms, then her chest, until her whole body was shaking. She sank down onto the porch steps and wrapped her arms around herself. "Property," she hissed into the empty air. She looked at her cracked hands. She looked at the failing fence. She looked at the vast, indifferent sky. "Never," she vowed. The word was a jagged stone in her throat. "I will rot in this ground before I belong to a man again. I will starve. I will die. But I will not be property." She sat there as the afternoon wore on. The sun began to dip toward the mountains, and the temperature plummeted. The wind changed direction, shifting from the west to the north, carrying the scent of ozone and wet dust. A dry storm was gathering. It was a common enough thing on the high plains, all the fury of thunder and lightning with none of the mercy of rain. The sky turned a sickly shade of green, then deepened into a bruised charcoal. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin, rattling the loose shingles she had failed to fix. Josie forced herself to move. She had to secure the animals. She had to bring in the wood. She forced the meeting with Luther into a box in the back of her mind and slammed the lid shut. Survival required focus. She was latching the barn door when she heard it. It was not the rhythmic trot of a buggy this time. It was the uneven, stumbling cadence of a single horse moving slowly. Panic flared again. Had Luther come back? Had he sent his men to drive the point home with violence? She ran to the corner of the cabin and peered out into the gathering gloom. The light was failing fast, sucked away by the thick clouds rolling overhead. A lone rider emerged from the haze of dust and twilight. The horse was a roan, its head hanging low, foam lacing its neck. The rider was slumped forward over the animal's neck, his hands tangling in the mane. He did not look like one of Luther's hired guns. He looked like a sack of grain tied to a saddle. As the horse neared the fence line, it stumbled. The rider did not correct the animal. He simply slid sideways. He fell from the saddle in slow motion, hitting the ground with a heavy, boneless impact. The horse stopped, blowing hard, too exhausted to run. Josie stood in the shadow of the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. It could be a trick. It could be a drunk drifter. It could be trouble she did not have the strength to handle. "Let him lie there," a voice in her head whispered. "Lock the door. You have your own problems." But the wind was screaming now. throwing sand into her face. The first crack of thunder shattered the sky, shaking the ground beneath her boots. If she left him there, the storm or the cold would kill him before morning. She swore softly, a harsh, unladylike word she had learned in the saloon. She ran out to the fence line, her skirts whipping around her legs. The man lay face down in the dirt. He was covered in a layer of gray dust that made him look like a statue toppled from its plinth. Josie knelt beside him, grabbing his shoulder to roll him over. He was heavy, dead weight. She managed to turn him onto his back. He was young, perhaps 30, with dark hair matted with sweat and dirt. His face was unshaven, the stubble black and thick, but what drew her eye was the dark stain spreading across the left side of his canvas coat. Blood, fresh and plentiful. He groaned, a low, guttural sound, but his eyes did not open. "Can you hear me?" Josie shouted over the wind. No answer. Thunder cracked again, closer this time, accompanied by a flash of lightning that illuminated the plains in stark, blinding white. She could not leave him here. "Damn you," she muttered, grabbing him under the arms. "You had better not be heavy." He was heavy. He was solid muscle and bone. Josie dug her heels into the dirt, gritting her teeth. She pulled. He dragged a few inches. She pulled again. It took her 10 minutes to drag him the 50 yards to the cabin. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her arms burned. She kicked the door open with her boot and hauled him across the threshold, collapsing backward onto the floor as his boots finally cleared the door frame. She kicked the door shut against the howling wind and lay there for a moment in the sudden silence of the room, gasping for air. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and the metallic tang of the stranger's blood. Josie scrambled to her feet. She barred the door. Then she lit the kerosene lamp on the table. She knelt beside the stranger. Now, in the light, she could see him clearly. He was not a white man, or at least not entirely. His skin was the color of polished teak. His cheekbones were high and sharp. He looked like the vaqueros she had seen passing through town, men who lived in the saddle and spoke a language the townsfolk of Faircross viewed with suspicion. She unbuttoned his coat with trembling fingers. The fabric was stiff with dried blood. Beneath the coat, his shirt was torn and soaked. She hesitated. To undress a man, a stranger, in her own home, the impropriety of it would have the church ladies fainting, but the blood was still oozing. She took her sewing scissors from the table and cut the shirt away. When she peeled the fabric back, she drew in a sharp breath. The wound was bad, a bullet graze or a deep gash along the top of his shoulder. It was ugly and inflamed, but it was not the fresh wound that made her pause. His chest and torso were a map of violence. Old, silvery scars crisscrossed his skin. There was a puckered starburst mark on his ribs, an old bullet hole. There were thin, white lines across his back that looked like lash marks. There was a jagged ridge along his collarbone where a knife had once opened him up. This was a man who had been broken and put back together more times than a man should be. He stirred, his head thrashing side to side. "Agua," he muttered. "No, don't." He spoke in a mix of Spanish and English, the words slurred by fever. Josie stood up. She needed a doctor. The doctor was in town, 3 miles away. If she rode into town now, in the storm, she risked her own neck. If she brought the doctor back, the whole town would know by morning that the widow Hart had a strange man in her bed. The rumors would turn from whispers to shouts. Luther would hear of it. He would use it. He would say she was running a brothel. He would take the land. She looked at the man. He was shivering, his teeth chattering. No doctor, she decided aloud. She went to the stove and stoked the fire, adding the last of her dry wood. She filled a pot with water and set it to boil. She found the bottle of whiskey Tom had hidden under the floorboards, the one thing he had left her besides debt. She went to her trunk at the foot of her bed. It contained her meager possessions, a winter quilt, a Bible she couldn't read well, and one good petticoat, white cotton with a lace trim, the only nice thing she owned from before the marriage. She took the petticoat. She did not hesitate. She ripped the hem, the sound of tearing fabric loud in the small room. She tore it into long strips. For the next hour, Josie worked with the focus of a surgeon. She washed the wound with boiled water, ignoring the man's groans of pain. She poured the whiskey over the raw flesh to clean it. He arched his back, a cry tearing from his throat, his eyes flying open. They were dark, unfocused, blind with fever. "Easy," she said, her voice unexpectedly gentle. "Easy now. It's clean." She packed the wound with a poultice she made from dried yarrow she kept in a jar, then bound his shoulder tight with the strips of her petticoat. As she worked, his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was shocking in its strength. "Did they pay you?" he rasped, looking right at her but not seeing her. "Did he pay you for the job?" "Shh," Josie said. She did not pull away. She recognized the tone in his voice. It was not the voice of a predator. It was the voice of prey that had learned to bite back. It was the voice of someone who expected pain as a condition of existence. "You are safe," she lied. "Sleep." His grip loosened. His hand fell back to the floor. His breathing leveled out, harsh but steady. Outside, the dry storm finally broke. The tension in the air snapped, and rain began to fall. It started as a few heavy drops, slapping against the roof like stones, then opened up into a deluge. Thunder rolled across the plains, shaking the cabin walls. Josie sat back on her heels. She wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Her dress was stained with his blood. Her petticoat was ruined. Her firewood was burning low. She dragged him, inch by inch, over to the rug near the hearth. She covered him with her winter quilt. Then she pulled her rocking chair close to the fire and sat down. She was exhausted, her body aching from the labor and the adrenaline, but she could not sleep. She watched the stranger breathe. The rise and fall of his chest was the only movement in the room. The cabin felt smaller than it ever had before. For 6 months, she had been alone in this space, the silence her only companion. Now, there was another life here, a man with scars that matched the ones she carried on the inside. She looked at his face in the flickering firelight. He looked hard, even in sleep. He looked like the kind of trouble everyone had warned her about. "Who are you?" she whispered to the darkness. The rain hammered against the roof, washing the dust from the world outside, turning the dry creek into a river. Inside, Josie Hart sat vigil over a stranger, gripping the arms of her chair, knowing that by morning, everything would be different. The wind howled, but for the first time in a long time, she was not just listening to the sound of her own loneliness. The dawn did not break so much as it bled into the sky. The storm that had raged through the night had exhausted itself, leaving behind a world stripped clean and shivering in the damp gray light. The relentless dust of the high plains had been turned into a thick, clinging gumbo mud that coated the boots and the hem of Josie Hart's dress as she stepped off the porch. The air smelled of wet sage and cold iron. It was a sharp, biting scent that filled the lungs and woke the senses. Josie looked out over her homestead. The storm had been cruel. A section of the split rail fence near the creek bed was down, the rails scattered like matchsticks. The few surviving chickens were huddled under the eaves of the barn, looking wet and miserable. But the roof of the cabin, despite its leaks, had held. She turned back inside, shaking the moisture from her shawl. The cabin was dim, illuminated only by the dying embers in the hearth and the gray square of the window. On the rug near the fire, the stranger was still asleep. Josie moved quietly, setting the kettle on the iron hook over the coals. She knelt beside him, her knees popping in the silence. In the daylight, he looked less like a phantom and more like a man who had ridden through hell. His face was drawn, the skin beneath the dark stubble pale and slick with a sheen of sweat. She reached out to check the bandage on his shoulder. Her fingers brushed the skin of his neck, and heat radiated from him. He was feverish, but his breathing was steady. The bleeding had stopped. As she pulled her hand back, his eyes snapped open. They were dark eyes, almost black, and for a second, they were entirely void of recognition. His hand shot out, grasping for a holster that wasn't there. He tried to scramble backward, his boots scraping against the floorboards. a guttural sound of warning trapped in his throat. "Easy," Josie said, holding her hands up, palms open. "You are safe. You are in my house." The man froze. He stared at her, blinking slowly as the room came into focus. He looked at the rough timber walls, the low ceiling, and finally, at the woman kneeling in the calico dress. The adrenaline drained out of him, replaced by a grimace of sharp pain as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. "My horse," he rasped. His voice was like grinding stones. "In the barn," Josie said. "I rubbed him down and gave him some hay. He's in better shape than you." He let out a long breath and tried to push himself into a sitting position. "I have imposed enough. I need to be moving." "You are not moving anywhere," Josie said flatly. "You lost a pint of blood last night, maybe more." "I have ridden on worse," he insisted. He managed to get one boot under him, his jaw set in a stubborn line. He pushed up, his good arm shaking with the effort. He made it halfway to his feet before his knees buckled. He went down hard, catching himself on the table leg, gasping as the room spun around him. Josie did not rush to help him. She stayed where she was, watching him with a mixture of pity and practicality. A man's pride was a fragile thing, and she knew better than to shatter it by treating him like an invalid. Even if he was one. "The floor is hard," she observed quietly. "The cot is not much better, but it is off the ground." The stranger stayed on his knees for a long moment, his head bowed, breathing heavily. When he looked up, the wariness was still there, but the arrogance had been tempered by humiliation. "I am obliged to you, ma'am," he said stiffly. "I am Josie Hart. Caleb Rios." He gave the name as if it were a challenge, or perhaps a warning. He watched her face, waiting for the reaction people usually had in this part of the territory. The narrowing of the eyes, the shift in posture that signaled distaste for his mixed blood or his foreign surname. Josie simply nodded. "Well, Mr. Rios, if you can get yourself to that chair. I have coffee. It is weak, but it is hot." He managed to drag himself to the chair. They sat in silence as the morning brightened. Josie poured him a tin cup of coffee. He held it with both hands, the steam rising around his face. "I was headed south," he said after a long time. "Drifting. Left a job up in Wyoming territory." "Drifting is a hard profession in winter," Josie said. "Better than some I have had." He took a sip, his eyes scanning the room, noting the lack of a man's presence. No pipe on the mantel. No heavy boots by the door. "Your husband, he is out tending stock?" "I was married to Tom Hart," Josie said. She stood up and moved to the stove, keeping her back to him. "He is dead. 6 months now." She offered no details. She did not tell him about the whiskey rage or the bruises. She did not tell him that the silence in the cabin was the greatest luxury she had ever known. Caleb watched her back. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she held the ladle like a weapon. "I am sorry for your loss," he said, the words automatic. Josie turned and looked at him. Her eyes were the color of the winter sky, pale and unyielding. "Don't be," she said. The silence that stretched between them then was thick, but it was not hostile. It was the silence of two people who understood that the truth was a dangerous thing to share with strangers. Caleb had his secrets, written in the scars on his chest and the bullet hole in his shoulder. Josie had hers, etched into the lines around her mouth and the emptiness of her house. They tacitly agreed, in that moment, to leave those stones unturned. Over the next 4 days, the cabin became a small, enclosed world. The High Plains winter, always fickle, turned the landscape into an adversary of shifting moods. The mud froze into jagged ruts that could break an ankle. The sun came out, blinding and bright, but it carried no warmth, only a glare that seared the eyes. Caleb Rios was a terrible patient. As soon as the fever broke on the second day, he became restless. He paced the small room like a caged wolf, testing the range of motion in his left arm, gritting his teeth against the pain. "I cannot pay you in coin," he told her on the third morning, standing by the window and watching her struggle to haul a bucket of water from the well. "I have $4 in my saddlebags and a horse I cannot sell." "I did not ask for payment," Josie said, setting the heavy bucket down on the table. Her face was flushed from the cold and the exertion. "I do not take charity," Caleb replied. His voice was hard. "I pay my way." He walked out the door before she could stop him. Through the window, she watched him go to the wood pile. He picked up the axe with his right hand, his good hand. He could not swing it with two hands, so he used the weight of the axe head, lifting it and letting it fall with a rhythmic, controlled violence. He split log after log, his breath pluming in the frigid air, his movements efficient and practiced. He did not stop until the wood box was full. When he came back inside, he was gray with exhaustion and his bandage was spotted with fresh blood. But he looked Josie in the eye with a defiance she understood all too well. "The fence is next," he said. "The fence can wait," Josie said, handing him a bowl of stew. It was thin, mostly potatoes and onions with a few scraps of salt pork, but it was hot. "Sit down before you fall down." They fell into a rhythm born of necessity. They were two people surviving on the edge of the world, and survival required labor. Describe the intimate, quiet moments of their days, the sound of the wind trying to tear the roof off while they sat at the rough-hewn table, mending harnesses and darning socks, the smell of wet wool and wood smoke, the way the cabin felt too small when they moved past each other, the air between them charged with an awareness they both pretended to ignore. They worked side by side under the merciless sun to repair the corral. Caleb, one-armed and grimacing, held the posts steady while Josie hammered. They sweated through their clothes, the scent of honest labor hanging heavy around them. They shared the water ladle, their lips touching the same tin rim. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains and turned the sky a violent shade of violet, they sat on the porch steps, too tired to move. "This land," Caleb said, looking out at the endless expanse of brown grass and dust. "It wants to kill you. It does not care if you are good or bad. It just wants to grind you down." "It is honest, at least," Josie replied. She was rubbing her aching hands, her fingers swollen. "It does not lie to you. It does not make promises it won't keep." Caleb looked at her sideways. He saw the strength in her jaw and the sadness that lived in the corners of her eyes. He saw a woman who had been ground down but had refused to turn to dust. "You should not be out here alone," he said quietly. "I am not alone," she said, nodding toward the horizon where a hawk was circling. "I have the wind, and I have my debt." It was the closest she had come to opening up. Caleb did not press her. He just watched the hawk, his dark face unreadable. But the world outside the homestead was not as content to leave them be. In Faircross, the vacuum of boredom was always filled with gossip. The town had seen the smoke rising from the widow's chimney. They had seen the roan horse in her paddock. When Josie went into town for flour and coffee, the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer just the cold shoulder. It was an active, sneering hostility. "Got yourself a hand. I hear—" "Mrs.," Gable said at the general store, her eyes sharp as flint. "Or is he a guest?" "He is working for his keep," Josie said, keeping her voice level as she counted out her coins. "I'll bet he is." A man near the Cracker Barrel chuckled. It was a crude, wet sound. "I heard he is a half-breed. Cannot expect a woman like you to be too particular. I suppose, not after everything." Josie left the store with her head high, but her face burned. It was worse when Caleb went into town. They needed nails and oil, and he insisted on riding in, saying his shoulder was healed enough to handle a gentle trot. He felt the eyes on him the moment he hit the main street. It was a sensation he knew well, the prickly heat on the back of his neck. Men stopped their conversations to watch him pass. They did not look him in the eye. They looked at his gun belt, then at his horse, then at the ground, spitting tobacco juice near his horse's hooves. He was in the blacksmith's shed, buying a pound of nails, when the shadow fell over him. "You look familiar," a voice said. Caleb stiffened. He turned slowly. Luther Grady stood in the doorway, blocking the light. He was dressed in his usual finery, a stark contrast to the soot and grime of the smithy. He was flanked by two of his ranch hands, men with low-slung holsters and eyes that were too close together. Caleb looked at Luther. He remembered the man. It had been 5 years ago. On a cattle drive up from Texas, Caleb had ridden for the Grady brand for 3 months. He had quit when Luther ordered the crew to burn out a squatter family who had refused to sell their water rights. Caleb had walked away, but he had not forgotten the face of the man who gave the order. "Mr. Grady," Caleb said coolly. "I remember you," Luther said, stepping inside. The blacksmith made himself scarce, disappearing into the back of the shop. "Rios, isn't it? You were good with a rope, not so good at following orders." "I follow orders that make sense," Caleb said. "I do not follow orders that require me to shoot unarmed men." Luther smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "You have a high opinion of yourself for a drifter. I hear you are squatting out at the Hart place." "I am working for Mrs. Hart, fixing her fences." "Is that what you call it?" Luther laughed, and his men chuckled on cue. Fixing her fences, plowing her fields. Caleb's hand twitched toward his hip. "Careful!" Luther's smile vanished. He took a step closer, his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of coal smoke. "Let me give you some advice, boy, because I'm a generous man. You do not know how things work here. That widow, she is not a free agent. She has debts. She has obligations. She is a woman trying to survive," Caleb said. "She is my property," Luther said. He said it casually, as if he were discussing a stray heifer. "She was mine before she was Tom's, and she is mine again now. The law says so, the bank says so, and I say so." The air in the smithy seemed to vanish. Caleb looked at Luther, and for a moment, the rage was so pure and white-hot that his vision blurred. He wanted to draw. He wanted to put a bullet right between Luther Grady's eyes and end the rot that this man brought to the world. But he saw the 2 men behind Luther, their hands hovering over their guns. He thought of Josie, alone at the cabin. If he died here, today, there would be no one to fix the fence, no one to stand between her and this monster. "A woman is not a steer to be branded, Mr. Grady," Caleb said softly. His voice was dangerous, low and vibrating with restraint. Luther's eyes turned cold and hard as agate. "You get off that land. Rios, you ride on. If you are still there in 2 days, I will assume you are trying to steal what is mine, and I hang horse thieves and cattle rustlers." "I am buying nails," Caleb said. He threw a coin on the anvil. "And then I am leaving." He walked past Luther, his shoulder brushing the rancher's coat. The tension crackled like lightning before a strike. He expected a bullet in the back, but Luther just watched him go, confident in his power, confident that a man like Caleb Rios was nothing more than a nuisance to be swatted away. The ride back to the homestead was long. The wind had picked up, blowing dust into Caleb's eyes, but he barely felt it. His mind was racing. When he arrived, Josie was in the yard, feeding the chickens. She looked up, and the relief on her face when she saw him made his chest ache. She had been worried. She had been afraid he wouldn't come back. He dismounted and tossed the bag of nails onto the porch. "We need to talk," he said. They went inside. Josie poured him water, but he didn't drink it. He paced the floor. "I saw Luther Grady," he said. Josie went still. She put the pitcher down slowly. "He spoke to you?" "He knows me. I worked for him once, years ago." Caleb turned to face her. "He told me to move on. He threatened to hang me if I stayed." Josie sank onto the bench by the table. She looked small suddenly, the defiance draining out of her. "I'm sorry. Caleb, I knew he would cause trouble. You should go. Pack your things." "He called you his property," Caleb said. He watched her face closely. Josie flinched. She looked at her hands, clasping them tightly in her lap. "He likes that word. He said he has the law. He said he has the bank." Caleb leaned both hands on the table, leaning in. "Josie, what does he have on you? You need to tell me. If I am to stay, if I am to fight this, I need to know the ground I am standing on." "You are not staying to fight this," she whispered. "I am not leaving," he said. The certainty in his voice surprised even him. "Now tell me, He has a contract, she admitted, her voice barely audible. From when I worked at the saloon. He says the debt from my time there, and the money Tom owed, and the funeral. He says it all adds up to more than the land is worth. He says if I cannot pay, he takes the land, and he takes me back to work it off. Caleb swore softly in Spanish. It was a trap, a legal, vicious trap designed to ensure she could never escape. That evening, the wind rose to a howl, rattling the door on its hinges and making the lantern flame dance. They sat by the fire, the darkness pressing against the windows. I was 18, Josie said. She was staring into the flames, her face illuminated in profile. I was an orphan. I came west because I saw a picture in a magazine of the mountains. I thought it looked like freedom. She laughed, a bitter, brittle sound. I ran out of money in Faircross. Luther offered me a job. He was kind. At first, he gave me a room. He gave me a dress. Then he showed me the paper. He said it was just a formality. I signed it, and then he told me what the job really was. She wrapped her arms around herself. He sold me, Caleb. Night after night, he sat in his office and took the money, and he sent men up the stairs. He told me I was an investment. He told me I belonged to him until every penny was paid back with interest. Caleb sat on a stool near the hearth, his coffee cup in his hand. He did not move. He hardly breathed. A murderous rage was building in his chest, a black tide rising. He looked at Josie, at her cracked hands, her faded dress, the dignity she clung to like a raft in a storm, and he wanted to burn the town of Faircross to the ground. Then Tom wanted to marry me, she continued. Luther let him. He transferred the debt to Tom. Tom liked that. He liked knowing he owned me twice over, once as a husband and once as a master. She looked at Caleb then. Her eyes were wet, but she did not cry. I am not a person to them, she said. I am a thing to be used and traded. Caleb set his cup down. His hand was shaking. His knuckles were white. You are not a thing, he said. His voice was rough with emotion. It is what the paper says. The paper is a lie, Caleb said. A man who buys and sells people. He has no soul. He has no rights. He moved from the stool to the bench beside her. He wanted to touch her, to offer comfort, but he was afraid of frightening her. He was afraid that any touch from a man would feel like a claim. I have done things, Caleb said quietly. I have ridden with bad men. I have taken money for work that makes me sick to remember, but I never treated a person like cattle. He looked at his hands. I am sorry. Josie, I am sorry for what they did to you. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, beneath the table, in the small space between them. Caleb's knee brushed against Josie's. It was a mistake, an accident of proximity, but the effect was instantaneous. A jolt of electricity shot through Josie, a sharp, sudden awareness of his heat, his solidity. It was frightening because it was real. It wasn't the grasp of a customer or the heavy hand of a husband. It was just him. She pulled her leg back sharply, her breath hitching. I am sorry, she stammered. I didn't mean. Caleb looked at her. His eyes were soft, darker than the night outside. He did not pull away. He did not leer. It is all right, Josie, he said gently. It is all right. The air between them changed. It was no longer just the camaraderie of survival. It was something more dangerous. It was desire, fragile and terrified, pushing up through the cracks in the dry earth. Josie stood up abruptly. The fire is dying. We should sleep. Yes, Caleb said. He stood up too. They moved to their separate corners of the room. Josie to her bed behind the curtain. Caleb to his pallet on the floor. The lamp was extinguished. The cabin plunged into darkness. Josie lay on her back, staring at the invisible ceiling. She could hear the wind. She could hear the coyotes. And she could hear Caleb breathing, in and out, slow and steady. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart beat against her ribs. She wanted to reach out across the dark. She wanted to feel that warmth again. She wanted to be held, not as property, but as a woman. But she closed her eyes tight. She was a widow with a scandalous past and a mountain of debt. He was a drifter with a bullet wound and no future. They were two broken people in a broken house. To want more than survival seemed like a sin. And yet, as sleep finally came to drag her under, the last thing she thought of was not the contract, or Luther, or the gun. It was the way Caleb Rios had said her name, like it belonged to her. The high plains did not slide gently into winter. They were seized by it. The transition was abrupt, a sudden tightening of the land's throat. One morning the ground was merely hard. The next, it was iron, frozen deep beneath a sky that had turned the color of a bruised plum. Early snows dusted the scrub brush, not yet the deep drifts that would kill cattle, but a fine, granular powder that hissed when the wind drove it against the logs of the cabin. Josie Hart and Caleb Rios moved through this hardening world with a desperate, synchronized urgency. There was no time for the guarded politeness of strangers anymore. The timeline of survival had compressed. They worked from the gray pre-dawn until the moon was high and cold, racing to secure the homestead against the coming freeze, the cooperation between them, born of necessity, smoothed into a wordless rhythm. It was a dance of labor. When Josie struggled to lift a heavy timber to brace the sagging barn roof, Caleb was there, his shoulder wedged under the beam, taking the weight without a word. When Caleb's axe dulled against the frozen oak, he was splitting for firewood. Josie was there with the whetstone and a tin of oil, sharpening the blade while he stacked the split logs. They matched stride. They shared the weariness that settled into their bones like lead shot. At the midday meal, they ate quickly, eyes on the window, watching the clouds thicken over the mountains. The tiny homestead, once a shell of loneliness where the wind whistled through every crack, began to feel different. It felt anchored. The woodpile grew high and solid against the north wall. The roof ceased its rattling. Smoke curled thick and steady from the chimney. It was becoming a place where life was not just endured, but possible. One morning, the brittle peace was shattered. The air was still, the temperature hovering just above freezing, when the sound of lowing cattle and cracking whips drifted across the dormant cornfields. Josie, who was scattering the last of the grain for the chickens, straightened up, shielding her eyes. A dozen riders were cutting across the southeast corner of her land. They were driving a herd of perhaps 30 head of cattle, red Herefords with the distinct G-bar brand of the Grady Ranch flank. They were not merely passing through. They were pushing the animals right through her boundary fence, trampling the dormant winter wheat she had broken her back to plant. Josie froze, a spike of fear driving through her chest. Luther, before she could move. The cabin door banged open. Caleb strode out. He was not wearing his coat, only his heavy flannel shirt and his vest. He walked with a terrifying, fluid purpose. He did not look at Josie. He walked straight toward the riders. "Caleb!" Josie shouted, the wind snatching the name from her lips. "No! Let them go!" He did not stop. He walked until he was 20 yards from the lead rider, a man Josie recognized as one of Luther's foremen, a man named Silas with a gap-toothed grin and a reputation for cruelty. Caleb stopped. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, his thumbs hooked into his belt, dangerously close to the worn walnut grip of his revolver. "Turn them around," Caleb said. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the frozen field with bell-like clarity. Silas reined in his horse, looking down at Caleb with a sneer. The other riders circled, their horses blowing steam, the cattle milling confusedly around them. "This is open range, boy," Silas said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that landed near Caleb's boot. "We go where Mr. Grady tells us to go. This is deeded land," Caleb replied, his eyes tracking the movement of the other riders. "You broke the fence line. You are trampling the field. Turn them around." "And if we don't?" Silas asked, resting his hand on his saddle horn, inches from his own gun. "You gonna stop us? One cripple against 12 men?" "I'm healed enough," Caleb said, "and I only need to stop you." The tension pulled tight as a bowstring. Josie stood by the chicken coop, her breath caught in her throat. She saw the way Caleb stood, relaxed yet coiled, a posture she had seen in men who killed for a living. She saw the hesitation in Silas's eyes. They had come to bully a widow, not to fight a gunman. Silas laughed, a harsh, barking sound. You have got spirit, Rios. I will give you that. Waste of a bullet to kill you over a patch of dirt. He whistled sharply to his men. Move them out. Let's get these beasts to the creek. The riders wheeled their horses, laughing and catcalling, driving the cattle away from the cabin but still cutting a jagged scar across the land. They shouted promises that Luther would hear about the hospitality. When the dust settled, Caleb turned and walked back toward the house. He was trembling slightly, the adrenaline fading. Josie met him in the yard. Her relief had instantly curdled into anger, the sharp, biting anger of fear. What is the matter with you? She demanded, her voice rising. Are you trying to get yourself killed? There were 12 of them. Caleb looked at her, his jaw set. They were testing the line. Josie, if you let them cross it today, they will burn the house tomorrow. You do not know that, Josie shouted, stepping into his space, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. You are bringing trouble down on us. Luther was content to squeeze me with paper. Now you are challenging him with guns. I cannot fight a war, Caleb. I am just trying to survive. You are not surviving, he snapped back, his own temper flaring. You are just dying slowly. That is what men like Luther count on. They count on you being too afraid to stand up. I have stood up every day for 5 years, Josie cried, tears stinging her eyes in the cold air. I survived the saloon. I survived Tom. I survived the hunger. Do not tell me about standing up, but I do not have a gun, and I do not have a death wish. They stood there in the freezing yard, chests heaving, breath steaming in the air between them. The anger was palpable, but beneath it lay something else, a fierce, terrifying current. Josie was furious because she was terrified of losing him. Caleb was furious because he could not bear to see her bullied. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and his expression softened. The rigid anger drained out of his shoulders. I am not Tom, he said quietly. I do not fight to own things. I fight to keep them safe. Josie's anger broke. She let out a shuddering breath and wrapped her arms around herself against the chill. I know, she whispered. I know you are not Tom. He reached out, tentatively, and brushed a snowflake from her shoulder. Get inside. Josie, you are freezing. The apology was not spoken, but it was there in the gentleness of his voice and the way his eyes lingered on her face before he turned to go check the damaged fence. That night, the winter arrived in earnest. The wind shifted to the north and began to scream. It was a blizzard, a white wall of fury that slammed into the cabin and buried the world. Snow piled up against the door and hissed down the chimney. The cabin, usually drafty, became a siege tower. The temperature outside plummeted to 20 degrees below freezing, but inside, the fire roared. Caleb's cot was near the door, where the drafts were worst. By the time supper was finished, he was shivering, his injured shoulders stiffening up in the cold. Move the cot, Josie commanded, standing up from her rocking chair. I'm fine, Caleb muttered, rubbing his arm. You are freezing, and if that shoulder locks up, you will be useless to me tomorrow, Josie said, her tone brooking no argument. Bring the bedding to the hearth. They moved the pallet to the rug directly in front of the fireplace. The cabin was small enough that this brought him within a few feet of where Josie sat in her chair. The storm trapped them in a bubble of firelight. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the howling wind and the popping of the pine logs. They settled into a quiet domesticity that felt both dangerous and inevitable. Josie was darning a pair of Caleb's wool socks, the needle flashing in the orange light. Caleb sat on the floor, leaning back against the wood box, peeling potatoes for the morning meal with his hunting knife. The space was intimate. Every time Caleb shifted, Josie felt the vibration through the floorboards. Every time Josie leaned forward to check the fire, her skirt brushed against Caleb's arm. The silence stretched, heavy and warm. I am afraid, Josie said suddenly. She did not look up from her sewing. Not of the storm, not even of Luther, really. Caleb stopped peeling. He waited. "I am afraid that it does not matter what I do," she confessed, her voice low. "That once a woman has been branded, the way I have, there is no coming back from it. The town looks at me and sees a ruin. They see the saloon girl. They see Tom's property." She paused, her hands stilling on the wool. "I am tired of being a body. Caleb, just a body that men trade or use or bury. I want to be a person, but I fear that any man who comes close, eventually, he just sees the ruin. He thinks, she is damaged goods, so I can do what I like." Caleb set the potato and the knife down in the bowl. He stared into the fire, his profile sharp and dark. "I rode with a man named Captain Hatcher for 2 years," Caleb began, his voice rough. "Down in the territories, we were supposed to be protecting settlers, but Hatcher, he liked the power. We took things that weren't ours. We burned out families who wouldn't pay protection." He looked at his hands, strong, scarred hands. "I took Luther's coin once, too. I knew what he was. I knew he hurt people, but I took the money because I was hungry and I wanted a new saddle." He turned his head to look up at her. His eyes were open, stripped of their usual guard. "I have blood on me. Josie, more than you know. I look at you, and I do not see ruin. I see someone who survived the fire without turning to ash. I look at myself, and I fear I am no better than the men who hurt you. I fear that the violence is in my blood, that I cannot touch anything without breaking it." Josie looked down at him. Her eyes glistened in the firelight. She did not see a monster. She saw a man who was carrying the weight of his conscience like a stone. She saw a man who had chosen to stop running and stand in front of her gate. "You are here," she said softly. "You are here, and you are peeling potatoes, and you are keeping the fire lit." "I am trying," he said. "That is all a person can do." She replied. It was an absolution, mutual and quiet. Over the next few nights, as the snow kept them bound to the cabin, the emotional distance between them evaporated. They talked late into the night, their voices low, weaving a fragile web of trust. They spoke of the hunger of their childhoods, Josie in the orphanage in St. Louis, Caleb in a mission school in Santa Fe where the priests beat him for speaking Spanish. They spoke of being told they were less, Josie because she was poor and female, Caleb because his father was Mexican and his mother was Apache. They learned the maps of each other's souls before they ever touched each other's skin. The breaking point came a week later. The snow had stopped, and a lane had been cleared to the main road. Luther Grady came to the cabin himself. He did not come with a posse this time. He came with 2 men, but he rode right up to the porch where Josie and Caleb were repairing the railing. Luther did not dismount. He sat high on his horse, looking down at them with a benevolent, poisonous smile. "Josie," he greeted her, "I see you have kept your pet through the freeze." Josie straightened, gripping her hammer. "State your business." "Luther, just a friendly reminder," Luther said. "The 30 days are up next week. I expect you will have the full amount? Or shall I prepare the room at the Golden Steer? We have a new shipment of silk dresses. Red would suit you." He turned his gaze to Caleb. "And you, Rios. I heard about your little display with my cattle. It was cute. Like a dog barking at a train." Luther chuckled. "You know, we don't usually let mongrels sleep in the house in this county. We keep them in the barn where they belong. But I suppose a woman like Josie, well, she is used to lowering her standards." Caleb's face went stone still. He did not reach for his gun. He just stared at Luther with a hatred so pure it burned. "Ride on, Luther," Caleb said. "I'm riding," Luther said, gathering his reins. "Enjoy the week, children. It is the last one you will have." He turned and trotted away. Josie stood on the porch, shaking. She was shaking so hard the hammer rattled against the wood. It was not fear this time. It was a humiliation so deep, a rage so consuming, that she felt she might explode. "He," she stammered, unable to form the words. Caleb turned to her. He saw the tears of rage spilling over her lashes. He saw the way she was vibrating with the force of the insults. "Josie," he said. He reached for her. He meant to steady her, He meant to put a hand on her shoulder and tell her that Luther was a liar. But when his hand touched her arm, something snapped. Josie turned into his touch. She didn't pull away. She surged forward. She grabbed the lapels of his coat, her knuckles digging into his chest. "He thinks he owns me," she gasped. "He thinks I am dirt. He is wrong," Caleb said fiercely. He gripped her arms, pulling her close. "He is wrong." They looked at each other. The air between them, charged for weeks with unspoken currents, suddenly ignited. The anger, the fear, the shared trauma, it all transmuted in a single second into a desperate, blinding need. Caleb lowered his head. He gave her a moment to pull away, a heartbeat of hesitation. Josie did not pull away. She rose on her toes. Their lips met. It was not a gentle kiss. It was slow at first, tentative, testing the reality of it. But then it deepened into something fierce and hungry. It was a kiss that tasted of coffee and rage and winter air. Josie felt a shockwave go through her body, not the cold, seizing fear she had felt with Tom, but a hot, liquid rush of desire. She felt alive. She felt reclaimed, not by him, but by herself. Caleb groaned low in his throat. His arms went around her, pulling her body against his. He felt solid and warm and real. He did not grab. He held. They stumbled backward, through the door of the cabin, shutting out the cold and the world and Luther Grady. Inside, the fire was crackling. They broke the kiss, gasping for air, foreheads pressed together. Caleb's hands were cupping her face, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. "Josie," he whispered, "are you sure?" He needed to know. He needed her to say it. He would not take. He would never take. Josie looked at him. She saw the scar on his chin. She saw the question in his eyes, the fear that he might be crossing a line she couldn't defend. "I choose this," she said. Her voice was hoarse, but it did not waver. "I choose you. I want to feel something good. I want to feel you." She reached up and unbuttoned the top button of his shirt. The night that followed was not like anything Josie had known. In her past, intimacy had been a transaction or a duty. It had been something done to her in the dark. This was a revelation. It was the roughness of his calloused hands moving with reverent slowness over her skin. It was the weight of him, which did not crush her but grounded her. It was the way he watched her face in the firelight, as if he were memorizing a map to salvation. For Caleb, it was a surrender. He had spent his life fighting, stiffening against the next blow. With Josie, he unspooled. He found that his hands, so used to destruction, could be instruments of tenderness. He buried his face in the hollow of her neck and felt the pulse of another human being who did not want to hurt him. They moved together on the rug before the hearth, surrounded by the smell of pine and shadows. It was passionate. Yes, a frantic, boundary-pushing closeness where they tried to merge their broken pieces into something whole. But more than that, it was an act of defiance. Every touch was a rebellion against the men who had told them they were property, or trash, or nothing. In the dark, with the wind howling outside, they built a fortress out of skin and breath. Later, much later, the fire had burned down to glowing coals. Josie lay curled against Caleb's side, her head on his good shoulder. The quilt was pulled up over them. She stared at the ceiling, her body humming with a strange, heavy contentment she had never felt before. But beneath the contentment, the dread was already coiling back in. She had tasted it now. She knew what it was to be touched with love, and that made the threat of losing it unbearable. She knew Luther was coming. She knew the town would never let a widow and a mixed-blood drifter live in peace. The law was coming. The debt was coming. She shivered. Caleb felt it. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer against his warmth. He was half asleep. His voice rumbled in his chest, vibrating against her ear. "Sleep, Josie," he murmured. "I am here." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "Let them come," he whispered into the darkness, a vow made to the shadows. "I will kill any man who calls you property again." Josie closed her eyes. She held on to his hand, interlacing their fingers, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world of shifting sand. The piece they had built was as fragile as a sheet of new ice on a fast-moving river. It held the weight of their days for a time, but the current beneath it was dark and relentless. It broke on a Tuesday, under a sky the color of slate. Sheriff Miller rode out to the homestead just past noon. He was a man who had worn the badge for 20 years, and the weight of it had bowed his shoulders. He did not dismount. He sat on his gelding, looking at Josie and Caleb where they stood by the woodpile, his face arranged in a mask of apologetic duty. "I have a paper here. Josie," Miller said, reaching into his saddlebag. He did not look at Caleb. "I wish I did not have to bring it." Josie wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward. She did not take the paper. "What does it say, Sheriff?" "It is a notice of eviction," Miller said heavily. "Luther Grady filed it with the county judge this morning. He has called in the debts, the mortgage on the land, the funeral costs for Tom, and the outstanding balance on your previous contract." Josie felt the blood drain from her face. "He cannot do that. I have rights." "He has the judge," Miller said, his voice low. "The paper says you have 30 days to vacate the property. If the debt is not paid in full by then, the land reverts to the holder of the note. That is Luther." "And if I do not leave?" Josie asked. "Then the law says I have to remove you," Miller said. He looked miserable. "Do not make me do that. Josie!" Caleb stepped up beside her. His hand was nowhere near his gun, but his presence was a threat in itself. "And the debt? How much is it?" Miller named a sum that might as well have been a king's ransom. It was more money than Josie had ever seen. More than this scratch of land could produce in 10 years of bumper crops. 30 days, Miller repeated. He dropped the paper on the frozen ground because Josie refused to take it. "I'm sorry." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving the white paper fluttering in the wind like a flag of surrender. But the paper was only the first volley. Luther Grady did not just want the land. He wanted to scorch the earth beneath Josie's feet. The rumors started in the saloon, as they always did, but they spread to the church pews with vicious speed. Luther told anyone who would listen that the widow Hart was living in sin with a drifter, a man of mixed blood and low character. He painted a picture of a woman who had fallen back into her old ways, a harlot who had corrupted a good working man's home. When Josie went into town 2 days later to trade eggs for sugar, the change was absolute. She walked up the steps of the dry goods store, and Mrs. Gable, who had known her for 3 years, turned her back and locked the door from the inside. Josie stood there, her hand on the cold iron latch, watching the woman retreat into the shadows of the shop. She walked down the boardwalk, head high, but the whispers followed her like biting flies. Men she had known since she arrived in Faircross, men who had tipped their hats to her when she was Tom's wife, now looked at her with open, leering contempt. "Reckon she is charging him?" one man said loudly as she passed the livery stable. "Nah," another replied, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "She is giving it away now. Can't stay decent for long. Once you have been soiled." Josie kept walking. She did not cry. She did not run. She walked to the post office, found it empty of mail, and walked back to her wagon. But inside, something was withering. The tiny seed of dignity she had nurtured was being poisoned. Back at the homestead, the tension was a physical thing. It lived in the walls of the cabin. It sat between them at the table. Caleb saw the toll it was taking. He saw the way Josie stared out the window at the gray horizon, her hands twisting in her lap. He saw the way she flinched when the wind rattled the door. "We should leave," Caleb said one evening. He was cleaning his revolver, the smell of oil and metal sharp in the room. Josie looked up from the fire. "Leave?" "Pack the wagon," Caleb said. He did not look at her. He focused on the cylinder of the gun. "We can be in Oregon by spring. There is land there. Good land, where no one knows us, where no one knows Luther Grady." "This is my land," Josie said. Her voice was quiet, but it had a steel edge. "This is a trap," Caleb countered, looking up. His eyes were urgent. "Josie, look at what he is doing. He owns the judge. He owns the town. You cannot win a fight when the other man writes the rules." I built this cabin, Josie said, standing up. I buried a husband here. I worked this ground until my hands bled. If I leave, I am saying that none of it mattered. I am saying that I am just trash. Trash to be swept out whenever a rich man wants the room. You are not trash. Caleb stood too, the gun forgotten on the table. You are alive, and I want to keep you that way. If we stay here, he will come, and when he comes, there will be blood. I do not want it to be yours. So we run? Josie demanded. We run like thieves in the night, and then what? We find another town, and another man like Luther finds out who I was, or sees the color of your skin, and we run again? When does it stop? Caleb? It stops when we are alive and free, Caleb shouted. It was the first time he had raised his voice to her. This land is not worth dying for. It is the only thing I have ever owned, Josie shouted back. It is the only thing that is mine. They stood in the yard, under the pale, cold sky, their breath steaming in the frigid air. The argument was not really about the land. It was about fear. Caleb feared losing her to a bullet or a noose. Josie feared losing herself to the old feeling of helplessness, of being a leaf blown by the whims of men. I am not leaving, Josie said, her voice shaking with the force of her resolve. If he wants this land, he will have to drag me off it. Caleb looked at her, his jaw working. He looked at the woman he had come to love, standing small and fierce against the vast emptiness of the plains. He saw that she would not bend. He turned and walked away toward the barn. The crunch of his boots on the snow, the only sound in the silence. The distance between them lasted for 2 days. They worked side by side, but they did not speak. They ate in silence. They slept with their backs to each other, a cold chasm in the small bed. But the bond they had forged was stronger than pride. On the third morning, Josie went out to the barn to milk the cow. She reached for the heavy door, bracing herself to lift it and shove it open, as she had done every morning for 6 months because the bottom hinge was sheared off. The door swung open smoothly. She paused. She looked down. The hinge had been replaced. It was not a new hinge. Caleb must have forged it himself from scrap iron in the small forge corner of the barn. But it was solid, oiled, and perfectly set. Josie ran her thumb over the cold metal. He had fixed the burden she carried every morning, without a word. She finished the milking and went back to the house. Caleb was sitting at the table, staring at the empty fireplace. Josie went to the cupboard. She took down the blue tin mug, the large one with the chipped rim that Caleb favored because it held the heat longer. She poured the coffee, black and strong. She walked over and set it down in front of him. Caleb looked at the mug. Then he looked up at her. Thank you, he said softly. The door works well, Josie said. It needed doing. Caleb replied. He reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough, warm, and scarred. Josie squeezed his fingers. There were no speeches. There was no need to rehash the argument. He knew she would stay. She knew he would not leave her. They were in the trap together, and they would face whatever came through the door. The 30 days ran out on a Thursday. The morning dawned with a hard, bright blue sky, a deceptive beauty that hid the biting cold of the wind. The dust had been stripped from the frozen ground and whipped into the air, creating a haze that turned the sun into a pale, glaring disk. They heard the horses before they saw them. Josie was inside, washing the breakfast plates. Caleb was on the porch, whittling a peg for the harness. He stopped. He stood up slowly, snapping the knife closed and sliding it into his pocket. Josie, he called out. His voice was calm, but it was the calm of a man checking the load in his weapon. Josie dried her hands on her apron and walked out. Luther Grady was riding up the track. He was not alone. He had brought 2 men with him, not the sheriff, and not the town lawyer. He had brought hired guns. One was Silas, the foreman. The other was a stranger, a man with a long coat and a shotgun resting across his saddle. Luther looked magnificent and terrible. He rode a tall black stallion. His coat was trimmed with beaver fur. He looked like a king coming to inspect his unruly subjects. They pulled up 10 yards from the porch. The wind whipped the tails of their coats and tore at Josie's skirts. "Time is up, Mrs. Hart," Luther announced. His voice boomed over the wind. "I trust you have the payment." Josie stepped down one stair. She stood shoulder to shoulder with Caleb. "I have no money for you, Luther, you know that, and I have no intention of leaving." Luther smiled. It was a smile of genuine pleasure. "I was hoping you would say that. It simplifies things." He signaled to the man with the shotgun. The man racked the slide, the sound loud and mechanical in the open air. "This is not a legal visit, Luther," Caleb said. His hand hovered near his holster, fingers twitching. "If you want to evict her, bring the sheriff." "I am the law out here, boy," Luther spat. "And I am done playing games with paper." Luther looked at Josie, his eyes traveling over her with a proprietary, suffocating weight. "You have forgotten your place. Josie, you think because you found a stray dog to bark for you, that you are free? You are my property, bought and paid for. I have the contract in my safe that lists your name right next to the livestock." The words hit Josie like a whip. Property. He said it so easily. He said it in front of the man she loved. He stripped her naked with a sentence, reducing her years of struggle, her grief, and her love to a line in a ledger. "And you," Luther said, turning his gaze to Caleb. "I warned you. I told you to move on. But you had to touch what belongs to me." "She belongs to herself," Caleb said. "She belongs to the man who can afford her," Luther sneered. "And you are nothing. You are a mongrel who doesn't know when to run." Luther shifted in his saddle. He looked at Silas. "Shoot the breed," Luther ordered. "Dump his body in the ravine. The coyotes need to eat too. His blood will probably make them sick, but nature is not picky." The world seemed to stop. Josie felt her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. The landscape narrowed down to a tunnel. She saw the smirk on Silas's face as he reached for his pistol. She saw the man with the shotgun shifting his aim toward Caleb. She saw Caleb. He was hesitating. She knew why. She knew that in this territory, if a man with Mexican blood drew a gun on a white rancher, he would hang, no matter who started it. Caleb was freezing, caught between the instinct to survive and the knowledge that the law was a weapon pointed at his head. His hand shook slightly over the butt of his revolver. Luther saw the hesitation. He laughed. He reached into his own coat and drew a pearl-handled revolver. He leveled it at Caleb's chest. "Goodbye, boy," Luther said. Rage, white-hot and blinding, exploded inside Josie. It was not the helpless rage of the girl in the saloon. It was the volcanic fury of a woman who had lost everything and refused to lose one thing more. She saw Caleb's death in Luther's eyes. She saw the end of the only clean, good thing she had ever known. She did not think. She moved. Josie lunged to her right. Her hand shot out, not toward Luther, but toward Caleb's hip. Her fingers closed around the worn walnut grip of Caleb's heavy Colt revolver. It was a motion she had never practiced, yet her hand knew exactly what to do. She yanked the gun from his holster. It was heavy, much heavier than a hammer or an axe handle. Time warped. The wind seemed to die. The sound of the horses stamping their feet faded into a dull roar. Josie brought the gun up. She did not tremble. Her arms, strengthened by years of hauling water, by chopping wood, by fighting the earth itself, were steady as stone. She thumbed the hammer back. The click was the loudest sound in the world. She looked at Luther Grady. She looked at the man who had bought her, the man who had sold her, the man who had named her property. "I am not yours," she whispered. She aimed for the center of his chest. She pulled the trigger. The gun bucked in her hands. A violent, powerful kick that jarred her shoulders. The shot shattered the stillness of the high plains. A crack of thunder that had no storm to explain it. A cloud of blue smoke erupted from the barrel. Luther Grady looked surprised. That was the only expression he had time for. He looked down at his chest, where a dark, wet hole had appeared in the fine wool of his coat. He tried to speak. He tried to raise his gun, but the strength was gone. He swayed in the saddle, the pearl-handled revolver slipping from his fingers. Then He tilted slowly to the side and fell. He hit the frozen ground with a heavy, final thud. Dust puffed up around him. He did not move. For a second, no one moved. Silas sat with his hand halfway to his gun, his mouth open. The man with the shotgun stared at the body of the most powerful man in the county, lying in the dirt like common refuse. Then, the spell broke. Silas snarled and ripped his gun from his holster. "No!" Caleb shouted. He didn't need to draw. He didn't have a gun to draw. Josie had it, but he had a second pistol, a smaller hideout gun tucked into the back of his belt. He ripped it free, leveling it at Silas. "Drop it!" Caleb roared. "Drop it or you'll die right there!" Silas froze. He looked at Caleb's eyes. They were the eyes of a man who had crossed the line and was ready to burn the world down. He looked at Josie, who was standing there with the smoking Colt still raised, her face a mask of shock and ferocity. Silas slowly let his gun slide back into the holster. He raised his hands. The man with the shotgun lowered the barrel, looking terrified. "It is over," Caleb said, his voice shaking with adrenaline. Take him and go. If you reach for a weapon, I will kill you." "Do you understand?" Silas nodded. He and the other man dismounted slowly. They hefted Luther's body, an awkward, heavy burden, and draped it over the black stallion's saddle. They mounted up and rode away, looking back over their shoulders as if they expected the very earth to rise up and swallow them. Josie stood alone in the yard. The gun slipped from her fingers. It hit the dirt with a dull clatter. She looked at her hands. They were stained with gun oil and dust. They were shaking now, a tremor so violent she had to clasp them together to stop it. She looked at the spot where Luther had fallen. There was a dark stain on the earth. "I killed him," she whispered. She had wished him dead 1,000 times. She had prayed for it, but the reality of it, the finality of taking a life, was a crushing weight. She felt sick. She felt lightheaded. "Josie!" Caleb was there. He holstered his gun and grabbed her by the shoulders. He turned her away from the bloodstain. "Josie, look at me! Look at me!" She looked up. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear and awe. "Are you hurt?" he asked frantically, his hands running over her arms, checking for wounds. "No," she said. Her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "I took your gun. You saved my life," Caleb said. He pulled her into his chest, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "He was going to kill me. You saved my life. He called me property." Josie sobbed into his coat. The tears came then, a torrent of shock and release. "He called me property. You are not property." Caleb swore. "You are the bravest woman God ever made." They stood there in the wind, clinging to each other, while the dust settled over the blood. It was an hour later when the sheriff arrived. Silas had ridden straight to town, and the story he told had brought Miller and a deputy at a gallop. They rode into the yard with their rifles drawn. Sheriff Miller looked at the scene. He saw the gun lying in the dirt. He saw the blood. He saw Josie sitting on the porch steps, staring at nothing, with Caleb standing guard over her. "Put the guns away! Caleb!" Miller called out. "It is done." Caleb hesitated, then slowly unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the porch. He stepped down into the yard. "I did it," Caleb said. His voice was loud, firm. "Luther drew on me. I shot him. It was self-defense." Miller looked at Caleb. He looked at the heavy Colt on the ground. "A man's gun. A cavalry gun. Do not lie to me, son," Miller said wearily. "Silas told me what happened. He said the woman shot him." "Silas is a liar," Caleb insisted, stepping forward. "I shot him. Arrest me." "No." Josie stood up. She walked down the steps. She looked small and frail in her faded dress, but her eyes were clear. "Caleb did not shoot him," Josie said. Her voice carried the weight of iron. "I did." "Josie," Caleb started, turning to her. "I will not hide behind you," she said to him. Then she turned to the sheriff. "Luther Grady came here to steal my land. He threatened to kill Caleb. He called me his property and said he would take me by force. I shot him." She looked at the sheriff. Her chin lifted. "I killed him, Sheriff, and I would do it again." Miller sighed. He rubbed a hand over his face. He knew Luther Grady. He knew the kind of man he was, but he also knew the law. And in the eyes of the law, a woman had just gunned down a prominent citizen. "I have to take you in, Josie," Miller said. "It is murder." "It was justice," Caleb shouted. "He was going to kill us." "Then tell it to the judge," Miller said. "Deputy, put her in the wagon." The deputy dismounted and approached Josie. He took her wrists and bound them with a strip of leather. Josie did not fight. She looked at Caleb. "Do not do anything foolish," she told him. "I will get you out," Caleb promised, tears standing in his eyes. "I swear it." They helped her into the back of the sheriff's wagon. She sat on the hard bench, her back straight. Miller snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward. Caleb stood in the yard, his fists clenched at his sides, watching the woman who had saved his life being taken away. He watched until the wagon was just a speck in the distance, disappearing into the cloud of dust that hung over the road to Faircross. He was alone again, but this time he was not drifting. He had a purpose, and as he looked at the blood on the ground, he knew that the war had only just begun. The jail in Faircross was built of riverstone and iron, a cold, damp box designed to break the spirit as much as the body. Josie Hart sat on the edge of the narrow cot, her hands tucked into her sleeves for warmth. The mattress was little more than straw stuffed into ticking, and it smelled of mildew and the sweat of men who had waited here before her, men who had mostly gone on to the gallows or the territorial prison. It was mid-December now. The wind had found every crack in the mortar, whistling a low, mournful note that never ceased. Outside, the street was a frozen rut of mud and ice, but inside, the air was still and heavy with the weight of the town's judgment. The cell had a small window, barred and set high in the wall, looking out onto the alleyway. It was her only connection to the world, and it had become a torment. During the day, women would come. They stood on tiptoes or boxes to peer in, their faces framed by bonnets, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and thrill. They whispered behind their hands. Josie heard the words harlot, murderess, and Jezebel. She saw the smug satisfaction on the faces of the church matrons who had turned their backs on her in the dry goods store. They looked at her not as a woman who had defended herself, but as a cautionary tale, a creature that had slipped the leash of decency and needed to be put down. The men were worse. They did not whisper. They stood in clusters near the sheriff's office, chewing tobacco and muttering loud enough for her to hear. "Ought to string her up," a voice would drift through the bars. "Make an example. You let a woman shoot a man like Luther Grady, and no husband in this county is safe." Josie pulled the thin gray blanket tighter around her shoulders. She tried to block them out, but the isolation was a physical ache. She was alone in a stone box, and the memory of the gun jumping in her hand played over and over in her mind like a nightmare she could not wake from. The door to the cell block creaked open. It was Deputy Barnes. He was a young man with a weak chin and eyes that roamed too freely. He carried a tin plate of beans and a heel of stale bread. He slid the plate through the slot in the bars, but he did not leave. He leaned against the iron, watching her. "You look cold, Josie," he said. His voice was oily. "I am fine," Josie said, not looking at him. "You know," Barnes continued, hooking his thumbs in his belt, "it is a long time until trial. A woman used to company must get lonely in here." He chuckled, a wet, ugly sound. "I reckon you know how to barter for comfort. Everyone says you were Luther's best earner back in the day. Maybe you and I could work something out. An extra blanket, some whiskey." Josie looked up then. Her eyes were hollow, rimmed with dark circles, but the spark in them had not been extinguished. "I would rather freeze," she said. Barnes's face darkened. He stepped closer to the bars. "Don't you play the high and mighty lady with me. We know what you are. You are just a whore who got lucky with a lucky shot. When the judge is done with you, you will beg for—" "Barnes!" The shout came from the doorway. Sheriff Miller stood there, shaking the snow from his heavy coat. His face was stern, his mustache bristling with irritation. "Get away from that cell," Miller ordered. "I was just feeding the prisoner." "Sheriff," Barnes stammered, backing away. "You feed her and you leave," Miller said, walking into the room. "She is a prisoner under the protection of this office. If I hear you speaking to her like that again, you will be handing in your badge. Now get out." Barnes scuttled out, casting one last resentful look at Josie. Miller sighed and hung his hat on a peg. He pulled a chair up near the bars. Not too close, but near enough to speak without shouting. He looked tired. The lines around his eyes had deepened in the weeks since the shooting. "I'm sorry about him," Miller said gruffly. "He is just saying what the town is thinking." Josie replied. Miller took a pipe from his pocket and began to pack it, his fingers moving slowly. "The town is angry. Josie, Luther employed half the men in this valley. The other half owed him money. They are scared, and when men are scared, they get mean." "And you, Sheriff?" Josie asked. "Are you scared?" Miller lit a match. The sulfur flared brief and bright. "I am conflicted. I know Luther was a hard man. I know he pushed people. But the law is a straight line. Josie, you cannot just erase a killing because the man was a bastard. He was going to kill Caleb," Josie said. "And then he was going to take me back to that life. Is that the law, Sheriff? That a man can own a woman?" Miller puffed on his pipe, the smoke curling blue in the cold air. He did not answer. He looked at the stone floor. A man caught between the statutes in his books, and the uneasy feeling in his gut that justice and the law were not the same thing. While Josie rotted in the Faircross jail, Caleb Rios was riding through a white hell. He had left town the day after Josie was arrested, driven by a guilt that burned hotter than the fever he had survived. He had failed to protect her. He had hesitated. And because of that hesitation, she had been forced to kill. Now, the only way to save her was to prove that Luther Grady was not a victim, but a monster. He rode north, into the teeth of the winter. The landscape had transformed into a wasteland of ice and wind. The sky was a relentless, flat gray, indistinguishable from the earth. Snow blew horizontally, stinging his face like needles. His shoulder, the one Luther's bullet had grazed months ago, throbbed with a dull, constant ache in the cold. His fingers, wrapped in wool rags inside his gloves, were numb, but he did not stop. He sought out the ghosts of Luther Grady's past. He found the first one in a mining camp 40 miles north, a collection of tents and shacks clinging to a frozen ravine. He was looking for a man named Elias Thorne, a former foreman who had been fired by Luther 5 years ago. Caleb found Thorne in a saloon that was little more than a canvas roof over a dirt floor. Thorne was old, his lungs rattled by coal dust, drinking rot-gut whiskey to keep the cold out. "Grady?" Thorne spat when Caleb bought him a bottle. "Yeah, I worked for him, if you can call it work. It was slavery with a paycheck." "I need you to write it down," Caleb said, pushing a piece of paper and a charcoal pencil across the rough table. "Write what?" "The truth," Caleb said, "about the accidents, about the men who died when he ordered us to shore up the tunnels with cheap timber." Thorne hesitated, his hand shaking. "He is dead, they say, but his reach is long." "He is dead," Caleb said, leaning in, his dark eyes fierce. "But a woman is going to hang for it unless you speak. Write it down." Caleb rode on. He crossed the Powder River, breaking the ice for his horse to drink. He slept in abandoned line shacks where the wind whistled through the boards and he had to burn dry cow dung to keep from freezing to death. He found a woman named Sarah in a settlement near the border. She had worked at the Golden Steer before Josie. She had a scar on her cheek that ran from her eye to her jaw. "He did this," Sarah told Caleb, tracing the line with a trembling finger, "because I smiled at a customer he didn't like. He said my face was his to mark." She gave Caleb a letter she had kept, a threatening note Luther had sent when she tried to leave. It was proof of coercion, proof of ownership. "He made us sign papers," Sarah whispered, the wind howling outside her small cabin. "Contracts. He said we owed him for the air we breathed. He said if we left, he would send the law after us for theft. Caleb took the letter. He folded it carefully and placed it in his oilskin pouch, next to his heart. "Thank you," he said. "Save her," Sarah said, gripping his arm. "Don't let him win from the grave." Caleb pushed himself harder than he had ever pushed a horse. He rode through blizzards that turned the world into a swirling vortex of white, where direction was a guess and survival was a gamble. He ate dried beef and snow. He lost weight, his face becoming gaunt, his eyes burning with exhaustion. But every time he thought of stopping, he saw Josie in that cell. He saw the way she had looked holding the gun, terrified, but standing tall. He would not fail her again. He returned to Faircross periodically to deposit his evidence with the town lawyer, a nervous man named Abernathy, who had agreed to take the case only because Caleb had paid him in gold coin earned from selling his saddle and his second horse. During these brief returns, Caleb went to the jail. Sheriff Miller allowed the visits, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of respect for Caleb's determination. He let Caleb stand in the corridor, separated from Josie by the iron bars. "You look thin," Josie said softly, reaching through the bars to touch his face. Her fingers were cold. "I'm fine," Caleb lied. "I found a man in Silver Creek. He has the ledgers. Josie, the ones that show Luther was bribing the land agent to deny claims so he could buy them cheap. You are doing too much," Josie whispered. "You are killing yourself for me." "I would die for you," Caleb said simply. "But I plan to live with you." The jail was a grim place, but in those moments, it held a strange, luminous grace. They did not talk of the trial or the hanging. They talked of the life they were trying to reach. "When we get back to the cabin," Caleb said, his voice raspy with fatigue, "I am going to build a proper porch, facing west, so we can watch the sun go down without the wind hitting us. And a stove," Josie added, closing her eyes, imagining it. "A cast-iron stove that holds the heat all night. No more open hearths." "A stove," Caleb agreed. "And we will plant winter wheat, and maybe apple trees near the creek." Apple trees. Josie smiled. A faint, fragile thing. It takes 5 years for them to bear fruit. "We have time," Caleb said, gripping her hand through the bars. "We have time." Sheriff Miller, sitting at his desk in the outer office, would stop his paperwork and listen. He heard the longing in their voices, not the desperate plotting of criminals, but the simple, heartbreaking hope of two people who just wanted a home. He found himself staring at the wanted posters on his wall, wondering when the law had become a weapon to punish the weak for surviving. The trial began in late January. The courthouse was packed, every bench was filled, and men stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The room smelled of wet wool, stale tobacco, and unwashed bodies. The heat from the potbelly stove was stifling, creating a heavy, drowsy atmosphere that sat at odds with the tension in the air. Outside, the snow was piled 4 feet high along the boardwalks. Wagons were huddled in the street. People had come from miles around, drawn by the spectacle of the widow Hart standing for her life. Judge Holloway sat behind the high bench. He was a man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that held no mercy. He had dined at Luther Grady's table many times. The prosecutor was a man named Mr. Finch from the territorial capital. He was slick, wearing a suit that cost more than Josie's farm. He paced before the jury, 12 white men, ranchers and shopkeepers, their faces set in stone. Finch painted a picture of Josie that made the townspeople gasp. "She is a spider!" Finch thundered, pointing a finger at Josie where she sat at the defense table. A woman of low morals, a woman who sold her affection in a saloon, who trapped a good man into marriage, and then, when the money ran out, seduced a drifter to help her murder the most prominent citizen of our community. He dismissed the contract. He dismissed the threats. He made it a story of greed and lust. When Caleb took the stand, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It became hostile, sharp with racial animus. "State your name," Finch barked. "Caleb Rios. And your relation to the accused?" "I work for her, and I love her." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. a white woman and a half-breed. It was a scandal made flesh. Caleb kept his voice steady, though his hands gripped the brim of his hat until his knuckles turned white. Luther Grady came to the land with hired guns. Caleb told the jury. He threatened to kill me. He threatened to take Mrs. Hart by force. He called her his property. Did you see him draw his weapon? Finch asked sneeringly. He had a gun in his hand, Caleb said. But did he fire? No, because she shot him first. So she shot a man who had not fired a shot? Finch pounced. She gunned down a man in cold blood while you stood by? It was not cold blood, Caleb shouted, half rising. It was defense. He was a monster who thought he owned people. The judge banged his gavel. Sit down, Mr. Rios, or I will have you removed. Caleb sat, his chest heaving. He looked at the jury. He saw their eyes. They did not see a man defending his love. They saw a threat to their order. Then, it was Josie's turn. She walked to the stand. Her dress was clean but threadbare. She looked thin, her cheekbones sharp. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Her lawyer, Abernathy, asked her gently to tell her story. Josie's voice trembled at first, barely audible over the shifting of the crowd. Speak up, the judge commanded. Josie took a breath. She looked at Caleb, sitting in the front row. He nodded to her. I was 18, she said, her voice strengthening. I was alone. Luther Grady offered me work. I thought it was cleaning. Then he made me sign a paper. She looked out at the faces of the town, the women who judged her, the men who had used her. He sold me, she said clearly. In the rooms above the Golden Steer. He took the money, and he added it to my debt. He told me I was an investment. When I married Tom, Luther transferred the deed like I was a horse. The courtroom was dead silent. He came to my house that day, Josie continued, her eyes hard and dry. He told me he was taking the land. He told me he was taking me back to the saloon, and he told his men to kill Caleb and dump his body in the ravine. She paused. She looked at the jury. I did not shoot him for the land, she said. I shot him because he called me his property. And I am not property. I am a human being, and I would rather hang as a person than live as a slave. She sat back. The silence held for a long moment, then broke into a roar of whispers. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The town waited. The tension was electric. In the saloon, bets were being taken on the verdict. Outside the jail, a crowd gathered each evening, their mood shifting from curiosity to anger. Elias Grady, Luther's cousin, had arrived in town, and he was buying drinks and stirring up the men, talking about how the law was too slow, how justice needed a rope. When the jury returned, the snow was falling again, thick and heavy. Josie stood. Caleb stood in the gallery, his heart hammering against his ribs. We find the defendant, the foreman said, looking at his boots. Not guilty of murder in the first degree. A gasp went through the room. Josie sagged against the table. But, the foreman continued, guilty of a manslaughter. It was a compromise, a way to acknowledge that Luther was dangerous, but also to affirm that a woman could not kill a man without consequence. Judge Holloway looked at Josie over his spectacles. Josephine Hart, you have been found guilty of taking a human life. The circumstances offer some mitigation, but the law demands a price. Sentencing will be passed tomorrow morning, and I warn you, I intend to be severe. We cannot have anarchy on the plains. The gavel banged. The courtroom erupted. Half the room was furious she hadn't been acquitted. The other half, whipped up by Elias Grady, was furious she hadn't been convicted of murder. Hang her anyway, a voice shouted from the back. She killed a white man, another yelled. Sheriff Miller and his deputies hurried Josie out the side door, shielding her from the sudden surge of the crowd. Caleb tried to reach her, but he was held back by the press of bodies. He saw her face one last time as she was shoved into the wagon. She looked terrified, not of the law, but of the mob. As the wagon rattled away toward the jail, Caleb stood on the courthouse steps. The snow swirled around him, cold and indifferent. He heard the shouts of the men gathering around Elias Grady. He saw the whiskey bottles being passed. The verdict had not brought peace. It had brought a match to a powder keg. Caleb touched the gun under his coat. He knew with a chilling certainty that the trial was over, but the fight was not. The law had failed them. Now, there was only the night, the snow, and the will to survive. The sun set that evening like a fresh wound across the throat of the sky. It bled a heavy, crimson light over the snow-packed streets of Faircross, turning the drifts into mounds of bruised purple. The air was brittle with cold, snapping at 20 degrees below freezing. But the temperature did not cool the temper of the men gathering outside the Golden Steer Saloon. Elias Grady stood on a whiskey crate, his breath pluming in the frigid air like dragon smoke. He was Luther's cousin, a man cut from the same rough cloth but without Luther's veneer of gentlemanly polish. Elias was raw-boned and mean, his eyes burning with the fanaticism of a man who believes his family name grants him the right to rule. "The court has gone soft," Elias bellowed to the crowd of 30 men. They were a mix of ranch hands, drifters, and townsfolk who had let fear curdle into hate. They held ropes and rifles, their faces hidden by scarves, their courage bolstered by cheap rye. "They call it manslaughter. They call it provocation. I tell you, it is murder. A woman shoots a Grady, and the judge slaps her wrist. If we let this stand, there is no law in this valley." Sheriff Miller watched from the window of his office. The glass was frosted at the corners, framing the mob in a vignette of impending violence. He saw the torches being lit. He saw the way the men moved, a single organism driven by bloodlust. He looked at his deputy, who was pale and sweating despite the cold. "Go home, Barn," Miller said quietly. "But, Sheriff, go home. Take off the badge. Go out the back." Barnes did not argue. He fled, leaving Miller alone with the silence of the jail and the roar of the approaching storm. Miller walked back to the cell block. The heavy iron key ring felt cold in his hand. He stopped in front of Josie's cell. She was standing by the bars, her face white, listening to the shouts drifting down the street. "They are coming," she whispered. "Yes," Miller said. He looked at her. He thought about the law he had sworn to uphold. The law said she was a prisoner until sentencing. The law said he should stand his ground and defend the jail. But the law had not saved Luther from his own arrogance, and the law would not save Josie from Elias's rope. "I have been a lawman for 30 years, Miller said, his voice sounding old and tired. "I have seen justice done, and I have seen vengeance masquerading as justice. Tonight is not justice." He put the key in the lock. The mechanism clicked. A loud, sharp sound in the quiet corridor. The door swung open. Josie stared at him, unable to move. "Sheriff, there is a back door behind the wood storage," Miller said, speaking fast now. "It opens into the alley behind the livery. You go now. You run. But where? Just run. Josie." He grabbed her arm and pulled her out of the cell, shoving her toward the rear of the building. Josie stumbled through the dark storage room, the smell of sawdust and damp stone filling her nose. She pushed open the heavy oak door and spilled out into the biting wind of the alley. Shadows moved in the darkness. She gasped, shrinking back, thinking the mob had found her. "Josie!" It was a whisper, fierce and familiar. Caleb stepped out of the gloom, leading 2 horses. One was his roan, the other was a sturdy bay with the sheriff's brand on the flank. "Caleb!" she breathed, rushing to him. He caught her, his grip bruising in its intensity. "Miller sent word to me an hour ago," Caleb said, handing her the reins of the bay. "He told me to be ready." Josie looked back at the jail door, where the sheriff stood in the frame, a silhouette against the lantern light. "Why?" she asked him. "Because he knows they will hang you," Caleb said, "and he is tired of burying people for the Gradys." Caleb looked at the sheriff. He nodded once, a sharp, solemn dip of his chin. Miller nodded back, then closed the door and locked it from the inside. He would tell the mob she had overpowered a deputy. He would tell them she was gone before he could stop her. He would buy them an hour, maybe 2. "Ride," Caleb ordered. "Ride, and do not look back." Josie swung into the saddle. The leather was freezing, stiff as wood. She wrapped her coat tight around her. kicked the horse, and followed Caleb into the labyrinth of the night. They kept to the alleys until they reached the edge of town, then broke for the open plains. The snow was crusted hard, and the horses' hooves hammered a frantic rhythm against the ice. The wind was a knife, slicing through their clothes, stinging their eyes until tears froze on their lashes. Behind them, a roar went up from the center of town, a sound of rage and discovery. The mob had found the empty cell. "Faster!" Caleb shouted over the wind. They pushed the horses into a gallop, tearing across the white wasteland. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving them in a world of charcoal and black. They rode blindly, trusting the animals, trusting instinct. Gunshots rang out in the distance, wild shots fired in frustration, but the darkness swallowed them. The chase began in earnest the next morning. Elias Grady was not a man to give up. He organized a posse of 20 men, promising $100 in gold to the man who brought him Josie Hart's body. They rode out at first light, tracking the hoofprints in the snow. For 2 days, it was a game of cat and mouse played across a landscape that wanted them both dead. Caleb and Josie rode hard, sleeping in the saddle for minutes at a time. They cut across frozen creeks where the ice groaned threateningly under the horses' weight. They scrambled over rocky ridges where the wind threatened to blow them off the edge of the world. They wove through stands of bare cottonwoods that looked like skeletal fingers reaching from the snow. Caleb knew the land better than the town men, but Elias had numbers and fresh horses. "They are gaining," Caleb said on the second afternoon. Looking back from a high rise, a line of dark specks moved relentlessly across the white valley floor below. "We need to lose the tracks," Josie said. Her voice was rasping, her lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. "The Badlands," Caleb decided. "We head for the gullies. The wind scours the rock there. No tracks." They doubled back, riding through a maze of dry washes and steep ravines. It was dangerous riding. One slip on the icy shale would mean a broken leg for a horse and death for them. But they pushed on, driven by the terror of the rope. As night fell on the second day, the temperature dropped to a killing freeze. The horses were blown, their heads hanging low, breath wheezing in their chests. "We have to stop," Josie said. She could no longer feel her feet. "If we don't stop, we freeze." They found an abandoned line shack tucked into a cleft of rock halfway up a hillside. It was a ruin, 3 walls and a sagging roof, but it offered shelter from the wind. They led the horses inside the small structure, needing their body heat. Caleb found some dry wood in the corner, old fence posts stored there years ago, and managed to strike a small fire in the stone circle. They huddled together on the dirt floor, sharing the single wool blanket Caleb had brought. The exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing them down. But as the fire flickered, casting long shadows against the rotting logs, the fear gave way to a desperate, fragile tenderness. Josie was shaking, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Caleb pulled her into his arms, rubbing her back, chafing her frozen hands between his own. "We are going to die out here," Josie whispered. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the flames. "They are going to catch us, or the cold will take us." "No," Caleb said fiercely. "I will not let them take you, and I will not let you freeze." He held her face in his hands. His palms were rough, but his touch was gentle. "Josie, look at me. We are alive, right now. In this minute, we are alive." Josie looked at him. She saw the scars on his face, the fatigue etched around his eyes, and the fierce, burning love that had kept him riding when any other man would have quit. "I don't want to die regretting this," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't want to die wishing I had loved you more." She pulled him down to her. There was no hesitation now, no shyness. They clung to each other with the desperation of 2 people trying to anchor themselves in a storm. Their physical closeness was hushed but intense, fingers tangling in matted hair, foreheads pressed together, breath mingling in the cold air. They used their bodies to keep the cold at bay, drawing warmth and courage from one another's skin. In that small, broken shack, with the wind howling like a banshee outside and a posse hunting them down, they found a moment of absolute peace, They were not property. They were not fugitives. They were just a man and a woman, holding back the dark. The dawn brought no mercy. The sky was a hard, bright blue, the sun glaring off the snow with blinding intensity. They were saddling the horses when the shot rang out. It struck the wood frame of the door, sending splinters flying. "Inside!" Caleb shouted. Shoving Josie back, Elias had found them. He had tracked them not by their hoof prints, but by the thin trail of smoke from their fire. The posse was below them in the ravine, pinned down behind boulders and scrub brush. There were only 6 of them left. The others must have turned back, but Elias was leading them. And they had rifles. "Come out, Josie!" Elias's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Come out, and maybe I will let the breed live long enough to say goodbye." "Go to hell!" Caleb yelled back, firing a shot from the doorway. The return fire was withering. Bullets chipped away at the stone and wood of the shack. "We cannot stay here," Caleb said, reloading with shaking hands. "They will flank us." "There is a ridge," Josie said, pointing to the back of the shack where the roof had collapsed. "A goat path. I saw it yesterday. It leads up to the ledge above." "It is too steep," Caleb said. "It is that or die here." Josie said, "They left the horses." They scrambled out the back, crawling on their bellies through the snow. They began to climb the icy slope behind the shack. They were halfway up when a shooter spotted them. A rifle cracked. Caleb jerked violently, stumbling. He cried out, clutching his side. "Caleb!" Josie screamed. He fell to his knees, blood blossoming dark and red against his coat. "Go!" he gasped. "Josie, climb! I will hold them off!" "No!" Josie scrambled back down to him. She grabbed his collar. "I am not leaving you. I am hit," he groaned, his face gray. "I can't. I slow you down. Then we die together." Josie snarled. She hauled him up, her strength fueled by pure adrenaline. "Move your feet! Damn you! Move!" She dragged him. She shoved him. She clawed at the frozen earth with her fingernails. Bullets kicked up snow around their feet. They crested the ledge just as the posse reached the shack below. They rolled behind a massive boulder, gasping for air. Caleb was bleeding badly, the bullet having grazed his ribs, deep and painful. They had the high ground now. They were looking down into the narrow throat of the ravine. "You are trapped!" Elias screamed from below. "There is nowhere to run." He was right. The ledge ended in a sheer cliff. They had the advantage, but they had no exit. "Give me the gun!" Caleb rasped, trying to raise his arm. "Save your strength," Josie said. She took his heavy revolver. She checked the cylinder. 3 rounds left. She had her own smaller pistol in her pocket with 2. "Elias!" Josie shouted down. "Walk away! It is over!" "It is over when I say it is over!" Elias roared. He lost his patience, driven by hate and the madness of the chase. Elias broke cover. He began to run up the slope, slipping and sliding, firing his Winchester wildly. "Cover me!" he screamed to his men, but his men stayed down. They saw the position. They saw the desperation. They were hired hands, not martyrs. Elias scrambled up the last few yards. Reaching the ledge, he threw his empty rifle down and drew a hunting knife. He looked wild, his eyes rolling, foam at the corners of his mouth. He saw them. Caleb slumped against the rock, Josie standing over him with the gun leveled. "Property," Elias hissed, lunging forward. "You are just property. I will put you back in the dirt where you belong." He raised the knife. Josie did not flinch. She did not look at the knife. She looked at the man who represented every fear, every chain, every dark night of her life. Caleb, summoning the last of his strength, lunged upward, grabbing Elias's leg. Elias stumbled. Josie stepped forward. She placed the barrel of the revolver against Elias's chest. "I belong to no one," she said. She pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening. Elias was thrown backward by the force of the blast. He tumbled off the ledge, sliding down the icy slope, leaving a trail of red in the white snow. He came to rest at the bottom of the ravine, face up to the indifferent sky. He did not move. Silence descended on the canyon. The remaining men of the posse looked at Elias's body. Then they looked up at the ledge. They saw the woman standing there, gun in hand, the wind whipping her hair around her face like a war banner. One by one, they holstered their weapons. They turned their horses and rode away. They had earned their pay, but they would not die for a dead man's grudge. 10 minutes later, Sheriff Miller rode into the ravine. He had been following the tracks at a distance, a silent guardian who could not interfere but refused to abandon them. He climbed the slope slowly. He found Josie binding Caleb's wound with strips of her petticoat. Miller looked down at Elias's body, then at Josie. "He rushed you," Miller stated, his voice flat. "It was self-defense. Again, he had a knife," Josie said, not looking up from Caleb's side. "The matter's finished," Miller said. He looked old. "I will take the body back. I will tell the town he died in a lawful fight." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch of coins and a box of ammunition. He set them on the rock. "Do not come back to Faircross," Miller said gently. "There is nothing for you there but ghosts. Go west. Find a place where the name Grady means nothing." Josie looked at him. "Thank you, Sheriff." Miller tipped his hat. He looked at Caleb. "Take care of her, son." "With my life," Caleb whispered. Miller descended the slope. He loaded Elias onto a horse and rode away, taking the history of Faircross with him. Josie and Caleb were alone. They rested for a day in the shelter of the rocks, letting Caleb's wound clot and their strength return. Then, they mounted the horses and turned their faces toward the setting sun. The journey was long. It was a pilgrimage through the spine of the continent. They rode through mountain passes where the air was thin and cold. They followed rushing rivers that roared with snowmelt. Weeks turned into months. The white of winter gave way to the mud of spring, and then to the green of early summer. The landscape softened. The jagged peaks gave way to rolling, timbered hills. They found the valley by accident. It was hidden behind a wall of granite, accessible only by a narrow deer trail. It was a bowl of emerald green, cradled by the mountains. A clear stream cut through the center, flashing silver in the sun. The soil was black and rich. It was hard to reach. It was easy to defend. It was a place no surveyor had ever mapped, a place no one would bother to claim on paper. They stopped their horses in the tall grass. The silence was absolute, save for the wind in the pines and the song of a meadowlark. "Here," Caleb said. "Here," Josie agreed. They built their home from the timber that grew on the slopes. It was hard work. Their hands, once used for surviving the demands of others, now shaped a life of their own choosing. They felled the trees, peeled the bark, and notched the logs. The cabin was small, but it was theirs. Moments of quiet domestic intimacy began to knit their souls back together. One afternoon, a summer storm rolled in. Caleb was on the roof, trying to patch a leak with sod. The rain came down in sheets, soaking him to the bone. Josie stood below, laughing as he slid down the ladder in a splash of mud. He chased her into the creek, both of them fully clothed, splashing and laughing like children, washing away the years of grim survival. Another evening, Josie watched Caleb planting seeds in the garden plot she had turned. He handled the tiny seeds with a reverence and softness that made her throat ache. She realized that no one had ever looked at her with that kind of gentleness before. Their nights were no longer driven by the desperation of the line shack. They were slow and deep. They came together in the dark, not to escape death, but to celebrate life. They learned every scar on each other's bodies, the bullet wound on his ribs, the callus on her palm, and they kissed them as if to heal the memory of how they got there. They talked honestly about the shadows. Josie admitted that she still woke up sometimes with her heart racing, thinking she heard Luther's boots on the porch. Caleb admitted he feared that his past as a hired gun would one day catch up to him. "We are not those people anymore," Josie told him one night, tracing the line of his jaw. "We are the people who built this house. We are the people who survived," Caleb corrected her. "No," Josie said. "We are the people who lived." Summer turned to autumn. The aspens on the slopes turned to gold, lighting up the valley. On a crisp evening in October, Josie and Caleb sat on the porch of their cabin. The work of the day was done. The wood was stacked. The harvest was in. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the stream and the valley walls. It was a peaceful light, devoid of the blood-red violence of the plains. Josie looked at her hands. They were still rough, still working hands, but they were steady. She thought back to the day she had reached out and taken Caleb's gun. She remembered the weight of the steel. She realized now that the moment she pulled the trigger on Luther Grady, and later on Elias, it wasn't just an act of violence. It was the moment she had reached out and taken her own life back from the men who tried to steal it. She looked at Caleb. He was whittling a piece of cedar. His face relaxed, the tension of the hunted man finally gone from his shoulders. He looked up and caught her watching him. He smiled. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I was thinking that the wind sounds different here," Josie said. "It doesn't howl. It sings." Caleb reached out and took her hand. He interlaced their fingers, his grip warm and solid. "It sings because it has nothing to knock down," Caleb said. They sat together as the sun dipped below the mountains, plunging the valley into a twilight the color of bruised plums. The world beyond the granite walls might still be cruel. It might still be a place where men owned women and laws were written in blood. But in this small corner, hidden from the maps of men, they had carved out a victory. They had built a love that rose from the ashes of tragedy. They had defied prejudice, law, and death. They were scarred. They were changed. But as the first star appeared in the darkening sky, Josie rested her head on Caleb's shoulder and knew the truth. They were no longer anyone's property. They were fierce, they were equal, and they were entirely their own. Thank you for listening to this story. It has been a long journey from the dusty streets of Faircross to the hidden peace of the mountain valley, and I am grateful you rode the trail with me. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment and share your location. And if you enjoyed the tale of Josie and Caleb, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the American frontier. I look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, keep your powder dry.